And so I've been a researcher in finance theory for the last handful of years. And so I have a book coming out on finance theory. And while I was doing this research on finance theory, what I got really interested in is how can we understand the economy today in 2025, or especially post GFC, so post the Great Financial Crisis from 2007 to 2009. And what I got really interested in was finance and finance mechanisms. And it might sound kind of boring, and I think there's a large sense in which people are scared off by finance and how finance works because it just looks like a lot of numbers and fluctuations, and we think of finance as being about the stock market or finance as being about like debt. And I think, especially from certain more progressive left, what we might call critical political economic positions, finance is viewed very skeptically, right? So the left typically views finance and finance mechanisms as being either what's called like fictitious, right? So that's like the majority view that come from a Marxist perspective, view finance as fictitious. It's not truly productive, right? The productive economy is the stuff of land, labor, and capital, is what they say. So really, Marxists view finance as kind of like siphoning off of, or as exacerbating or accentuating the productive economy, but that it itself is not productive, right? And then other kind of lefty or like center lefty progressive types view finance to varying degrees, with varying degrees of suspicion, right? But usually it's like, especially you see it today, right? The attack on Wall Street and Wall Street culture is just that it's simply like a predatory or rentier mechanism. And this is not to say that there aren't, predatory lending practices or that there isn't a rentier class, but that's typically how people think of finance on that side. I'm generalizing, of course, but on the more kind of, let's say, conservative or libertarian side, finance is viewed as, they have a completely different theory of value, so they're not as concerned with a critique of the mode of production like lefties maybe come from. So there tends to be some sort of sense in which finance is viewed as a really efficient capacity to mitigate risk and to also find new productive capacities for global capital, right? And so that, I'm generalizing, but I think that those are kind of like two ways of thinking about finance. Well, I kind of started to think, well, man, maybe we can think of finance differently. And maybe when we think about finance differently, that gives us a whole different understanding of how capitalism actually operates, right? And through the course of my research, I think I kind of cracked the nut on something. And I've published some stuff, and I've had great feedback on my book with a bunch of contemporaries and even people that maybe I would look up to, very impressed with kind of what I've unlocked, and saying, well, maybe you've kind of even given us a whole new theory of capitalism. And so this theory of capitalism is based on looking at how finance is not merely like a new phenomenon, because finance has been around for thousands and thousands of years. If any person, from when a person made a debt, a debt arrangement in some sort of pre-industrial society, that's finance, right? Double entry bookkeeping was developed in like Renaissance Italy, and it so that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's not a new mechanism. So I think that there are many iterations of how finance has fundamentally been around, and I think that we can actually look at finance as giving us a sort of insight and a key to how it is that the economy fundamentally operates, and then more importantly, that gives us an insight to understanding like what this thing that we call capitalism, or the capitalist mode of production, actually is. And I think it has to do with understanding finance more broadly. So that's what we'll talk about. So this is how capitalism really works. All right. So I will say I'm going to argue it's going to be it's going to be a little bit speculative. I've got some notes that I've written down, and a lot of this is based on kind of like an overview of my book, but really like the last chapter and the last portion of my book where I really outline these theses on like um what capitalism and how it operates by understanding finance, right? It might be a little bit speculative, but just bear with me. It's going to start to make sense, I think, as I kind of waffle on about things, right? Hey, Jack the Templar says, "Hi, what's the title of the book?" I'm going to just do an overlay of the chat here. Um, so the book is currently with a publisher, so it's not out yet. But so I'll keep everybody posted. But it's going to be something like the working title right now is like Thinking According to Finance. And then it's going to have some subtitle that's going to be about like speculation, time, and something else probably. But the idea is that what I'm interested in is rather than thinking about finance from outside, right? Like that's what most people love to do. We love to take an object, you like to stand outside of it, and you like to critique it, right? And there's a lot of value in being able to do that. But what is often the case is that you kind of put yourself in a position of objectivity, and you looked at the object, and you're kind of like, oh, I'm going to be able to critique that thing because I've got some sort of like objective position of knowledge outside of which I'm able to make the critique. And the fallacy of that is that actually we're always kind of embedded even within the objects of our own critique, right? And that they have an impact on us as we impact them. And so there's much more of a kind of like integrated relation. And so my thinking is that we need to actually allow for a space for finance itself to think. And we need to allow for finance itself to dictate some of the terms to us based on how it actually operates. Because I don't think finance is just merely some abstract object outside of us, like a rock or something like that. But it's a social mechanism, right? Like all economic activities are social activities. If you go to the root words of what economy means, it's oikos and nomos in the Greek, which means like how do you order your house, basically. Nomos is rule or law, and oikos is house. So economy is how do you order your house? How do you create the rules for your house? How do you structure your house? How do you structure the goods and services within your society, et cetera? That's the basic idea of what economy is getting at, right? And so I'm really interested in not presuming that we have some sort of objective idea that we can just use from the outside of looking at finance, but let's let it affect our thoughts as well by listening to it at a deeper level, a more social level, because we need to understand the social mechanisms within finance. And I think once we do that, then we can also understand capitalism. We can also understand the economy. I think it's just a really good mechanism for how to understand anything, actually, is kind of allowing it to inform us as much as we inform our perspective on it. It's a more integrated relation. Um, but okay, so but basically, so that's the kind of structure of things. Um, and so the way I'll say up front, the way that I think of finance and the way that I think of capitalism is that it operates through four. I created like this 4-step approach for understanding it. It's I, E, Q, and then U. The I stands for inscription. The E stands for enclosure. The Q stands for quantification. And then the U stands for the unconscious, or what's called like the archive of price. But we'll get into that later because that's a bit more abstract. But so inscription, enclosure, and quantification. What the fuck does that mean? Well, inscription is the act of writing or the act of meaning giving, right? So whenever you look at something, you can inscribe it, right, with certain meaning by saying that that thing is now another thing. So I think we talked about this on a previous live stream where it was like you could look at a forest, for example, and a forest, before any human gave it particular human meaning, was something outside of like human intellectual or conceptual um, enclosure, right? And so what someone could do is they can come along and they can be like, oh, this is forest. It is land for us to use. It is a possible site of resources where we can get water and wood that we can use to build our homes or make paper with or whatever, right? Once you've done that, you've inscribed meaning over to this thing. There are other high level ways that inscription takes place, which we'll talk about in a second, like debt contracts and legal arrangements and things like that. But in a very simple sense, that the act of inscription does that. Enclosure is the second activity where you then say, this is the act of privatization. You put up fences around that land, or you put up a barrier, or you create a legal contract that says this is owned by such and such an entity, or such and such a group, or such and such people, right? So enclosure is that activity of closing off, right? And in a very literal sense, historically, we have the English Enclosure Acts, that literally did this, that closed in the commons and that built up fences. If you've ever seen the movie The Searchers, if you've ever seen the movie Shane, if you've ever seen the movie Logan, the Marvel film, actually Wisecrack, we did a video at Wisecrack on Logan that I helped produce and write and do the research for a couple of years ago. It's like the philosophy of Logan, so you can check it out. And one of the things that we say that's so interesting is Logan is really talking about this old idea of enclosure that Shane, the Western Shane, also talks about as well, which is like, how can a man, say that their land is that land, this open common space is their land, and how can they privatize it? And that's when wars and battles start, because you kind of closed it off from somebody else, and they're fighting over this land and they're fighting over this land. And so the act of enclosure is an act of privatization, an act of cutting off. You could even maybe argue that it's an act of violence, that it's an act of theft, it's an act of expropriation, right? These are definitely things that people talk about in the literature. But so there's something that happens with this act of enclosure, where after inscription, where meaning is placed over what this land could potentially be used for human use, or for human benefit, or for human society, or whatever, then the act of enclosure is like, but it's for us, not for you, or it's for this corporation, not for the common people, right? That's the act of enclosure. And it's something that takes place to various different degrees throughout human history, right? There are probably more equitable and softer ways that we could think of enclosure. And then there are more stringent ways that we can think of enclosure. A really stringent way is being like, no, that resource belongs to us. I remember reading an anecdote years ago, and you'd have to check up on this now because I don't remember the corporation, but it was something like the rainwater that fell in one of the southern hemisphere countries was owned by some northern hemisphere corporation. Like the fucking rainwater of some domestic economy, some domestic society doesn't actually belong to the people. It actually belongs to some corporation in the northern hemisphere. Another great example is, so the city of Chicago was really struggling years ago to deal with some debt that they owed. So what they did is they were looking for assets that they might have within their city that they could maybe sell off or lease out or something like this, so they could get some cash flow in. So I'm pretty sure that it is the Saudi wealth fund, but it's definitely one of the big international wealth funds. I'm pretty sure it's the Saudi wealth fund. Came in and bought all of the parking meters in the city of Chicago for like 80 years. It's some like 80-year deal. Let me see. I'm going to Google this. Parking meters, Chicago, Dubai, maybe? Blah, 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 blah. They're owned by foreign investors. Chicago got into this contract. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it's blah, blah, blah. Oh, here, I'll just fucking share this screen. What am I doing? So the plan fell through. Chicago's 36 parking meters, blah, blah, blah. They got into a bad deal. No thanks. Okay, was formed as a company. It's mostly owned by Morgan Stanley, but it has a Saudi oil company as well as some German companies involved in the investment. So this is the idea. So they sold off their parking meters to this financial conglomerate that would inject money into the city of Chicago, so that Chicago would function, which means that the people of Chicago, whenever they're putting their money into their coin machines or paying for their meter, they're actually paying, Abu Dhabi. Well, and I was thinking Abu Dhabi, but this article also says that's Saudi oil company, which is what I was thinking. So I don't know if that's Aramco or, but I mean, it could be multiple different investors who are all part of this fund, right? That have taken in the asset, which the asset is the parking meters. So anyway, the point is this: is that you can privatize, you can inscribed. The meaning is, oh, for the city of Chicago, these parking meters, they can create spaces for people to park so they can go to the fucking movie in the middle of town or something like that. Well, we're going to carve it off and we're going to privatize it. We're going to sell it off for parts to some sort of corporation, right? So that's the second activity. So there's inscription and there's enclosure, right? And this happens all the time. Like I said, in softer ways and in more stringent ways, right? So Luke says, one thing I noticed is that it's not just the reservation of benefit within an economic market. The market isn't some side construct. It envelops everything. Yeah. So this is ultimately kind of what I would get at, is that when we start to think about how finance in particular operates as this massive umbrella to inscribe and close, and then I'll talk to the other 2 points, quantify and then price. When it does that, it becomes this macro force that moves faster and faster and faster, that gains more and more momentum, and that is able to swallow up more and more stuff. And we'll get there in a second. So inscription, enclosure, then quantification. Then after you kind of enclose it, then you can quantify. You can put a price on it. You can say that it's worth X amount. And that seems pretty clear. But there's 2 parts to quantification. There's what I call extensional quantification and then intentional quantification, and that's the last point. So extensional quantification is just a fancy word for talking about the types of quantification that can be cut up, carved up, and traded, right? Extensional quantification is what we think of when we're counting on like a number line. Parts are discrete units, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Or we could talk about extensional quantification with length, 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot. It can be carved up in myriad ways, right? So extensional quantification is essentially where it's extended, they're next to each other, right? And it operates by a logic of space. It doesn't operate by a logic of time, which is, I think, really important for what I'm ultimately going to argue. But it operates by a logic of space. And this is an argument that comes from the philosopher Henri Bergson, who says that when we think of time, he says we actually think about space because what we think of is we think of like discrete units of time, past, present, future, right? Or this moment, subsequent moments, right? And as soon as you do that, you're kind of carving up human experience, or you're carving up certain fluid flows, and you're making them these like discrete points or moments, and it all becomes very abstract. But there's a couple of problems that come from that, right? And one, it doesn't seem to fit actually with how it is that we understand time from a phenomenological or experiential perspective. 2, more and more science is seeming to back up the idea that time doesn't exist in that way. The kind of lay astrophysicist, I think his name is Julian Barber, Carlo Rovelli is another, that are presenting theories of time that people have been debating for hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years, because philosophers have been talking about this shit as well. But they're presenting new ideas for how it is that we can understand time, space as being different from it not really existing in this kind of like sequential format, right? That there is no real arrow of time, right? That time is moving forward towards like a particular direction, but that's not really how time functions. That's how we might interpret it. That's how we might experience it from one perspective, but that in reality, in actuality, that's not really the best way to think about things. So, but the point is that the way that the economy functions is that the economy functions absolutely according to an abstract linear sequential theory of time, where things are discrete moments. And the way that it does that is not only by thinking of things in terms of past, present, and future. I mean, after all, that's what finance operates from. You have a present price of something. You've got a past history of the market of prices. And then you've got a future gamble or mortgage on the future, a bet that you think that your property values are going to go up in a certain way, or some sort of futures contract where you think that, the prices of wheat are going to fluctuate a certain way. And so you can create you can place certain positions in the market against those speculative ideas, right? So there's a past, present, and future relation there. And then there's also a sense in which things are priced as discrete units in terms of numbers. This is given the value of 5. That's given the value of 6. That's incommensurate. So we got to figure out a way to make them be able to relate to each other. That's got a value of 100. That's got a value of 10 million. And then you talk about different currencies that operate differently, right? And they all fluctuate together. But the point is that they're all working together based on this abstract logic of like discrete units of quantification, right? Okay. So I know that's a bit kind of theoretical and abstract for the moment, but we're going to dig into this, I think, a little bit more, and it's going to help us understand like what finance really is. Okay, so that's IEQ, and then the U. Let's not worry about that for now. That's the kind of like where I whip everything back around and I try to say, aha, this is how we really understand how things work, right? The secret part. But essentially, it means the unconscious, right? That there is an unconscious that disrupts all of it, right? That inscription, enclosure, and quantification are activities that institutions utilize to leverage their power within an economy, but there's actually this unconscious level that's always challenging and changing how it is that those institutions and positions of leverage are able to actually operate. Of course, they're able to siphon off of and benefit from the power of the unconscious, the flux and the flow of that which is not yet quantifiable or enclosable or inscriptable. But nevertheless, it's more than any power is able to ever get a control over or get a hold over. Okay, but we'll get there a little bit later, and that's where I think that there's like a real power for the possibility of liberation and transformation is understanding that unconscious level. But that's super abstract and doesn't really matter because we want to know, how does capitalism really fucking work, right? Okay, so thesis one is inscription, right? Okay, so inscription. So finance creates meaning, and we'll just say the capitalist economy more broadly creates meaning through writing, right? Through debt contracts, receipts, credit history. And now finance operates according to what's called the first and second syntheses of time, according to what Gilles Deleuze demarcates and elaborates in his book, Difference in Repetition. So what that means is habit and memory, okay? So finance operates as habit and memory. What does that mean? So essentially, the way that the economy operates is through what Deleuze calls the first synthesis of time of habit, which is basically a point of compression within a given moment of time, right? That creates like a sort of abstract point or thing that we can relate to that then kind of dictates or determines what that thing is in an economy, right? So that's where the idea of inscription comes in. You look at an object or you construct an object, and that object then is given meaning. It's a coaster. So this coaster is now coasterized. It's inscribed as a coaster. It can't be anything else. Now, sure, I could throw it as a frisbee. I could use it as a weapon if I were really in a pinch, right? As a freaking ninja star or something. It could be a decorative item. I mean, it's got a little cow on it, so it's cute. So it's a decorative item. You could put a brand, you could put a Dolce and Gabbana brand on it and probably sell it for a whole lot more, right? But those are all activities that take place at that level of inscription and at the level of habit. Because now when someone sees a coaster, what do? They just automatically put their mug on it. Or when someone's looking for something to put their cup down on, they'll ask, hey, do you have one of those things? And what they're looking for is one of these, right? So there's a sense in which habit kind of just creates a certain accepted way of dealing with objects in the economy, right? And we don't do this with just coasters. We do it with tables and chairs. They take on a particular function, and that function is dictated by certain habits, right? So in the act of inscription, things are given a meaning, and that meaning becomes solidified, and it gets used as that and in no other way, typically, right? Again, not that you can't break the mold and use them differently. I mean, that's what artists do, right? That's when fucking Marcel Duchamp puts a fucking toilet in a museum and says it's a fountain, right? That's the whole play of that, is he's breaking the habit. He's breaking do you guys know about the fountain? Do you know Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain? Marcel Duchamp, The Fountain. So what year was this? And here's Duchamp. I'll share this. So Duchamp's Fountain, there it is. Yeah, the National Gallery. That was it. And that's it. That's the fountain. And it's just a urinal, right? So he just puts a fucking urinal there and says it's a fountain. Well, that's precisely one of the things that he's doing, is he's fucking with a couple of things. He's, obviously commenting on the snootiness of, kind of high end, high net worth individuals, conspicuous consumption, art fetishizing and stuff like that. But there's also something deeper that's going on there. It is kind of like playing with the habits of everyday life, right? So that's the first thing that takes place with inscription. The second thing is memory. And this is a type of memory that is stored so that in the future, the next time you encounter those objects that have already been formed by habit, you interpret them in the same way, right? And or you interpret them within a certain set of parameters. So maybe it's a coaster, but it's also a decorative item, and it's also maybe a paper holder. You can put it on top, something like that, right? So there's many uses or many inscriptions, many meanings that can be stored in memory, right? And so that's the first way that the economy functions. So when we look at objects in an economy, factories, they're used for particular purposes. Assembly lines are used for particular purposes. Robot technologies are used for particular purposes. Chips, everyone's talking about NVIDIA and the chips, right? With this tariff war and the trade war, and with the kind of prominence of AI coming to the fore, like the importance of chips. Well, they're taking on a certain meaning that is being inscribed upon them, right? And that is then being set within the social economy and the political economy, so that those meanings, those meaning objects, chips, are understood in a particular way as we move into the future. So they're inscribed not only in habit in the present, but they're also then kind of, there's like a store bank, a vault of memories of how it is that we can understand what a chip is and how it's supposed to be deployed, or how it is that we can understand what labor is. And this is where it gets interesting. Human beings and how it is that they function and operate in an economy, they also take on a certain abstract, conceptual, habitual meaning within an economy. You as a human are a worker. You go to school so you can become a better, more efficient worker. If you graduate college, you can become a white-collar worker. If you don't graduate college, you're a low-skilled, blue-collar worker. So you see how there's segmentation and abstraction that takes place at this first level of inscription, right? And this is how the entire economy functions. Always. There has to be activities of inscription, because that is the human social component that kind of like starts the engine, if you will, of any social economic activity. And therefore, by extension, any political economic activity as well. Oh, and what is political economy versus social economy? Political economy is essentially looking at the power asymmetries, or the power mechanisms, or the power divisions within an economic system. Who has control over what resources? How are those resources deployed? To what ends? To whose benefit? It's not just about nation states, although it can, because they're obviously major players in the power matrix, right? So it doesn't just mean political in the sense of like voting, but it's much more about like what mechanisms within a society, within a global economy, within a network of communities that are trying to figure out how to engage with their resources with one another. Who are the power players that are involved in dictating the terms, right? So that's what political economy is really concerned with. Okay. So that's the first thing, inscription, right? Inscription is about habit and memory. So I've got just this little, I'll just read it real quick because this is my little script that's based off my book, but I don't want to just put it up on the screen and read it the whole time because it's boring, right? But so here we go. This is actually a section from my book right here. Inscription. Inscription. So finance operates through acts of inscription, right? We could say that capitalism more broadly does as well. They're passive contractions at the level of habit. They're writings, they're marks, they're signs, they're meaning laden. Now, here's the thing. Those with capital power, the wealthy, they have leverage. They're given higher status through habit because of history, right? Like fucking Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and BlackRock and all these other things. They have a status. As soon as you say, my buddy works for Goldman, or I got friends at Sequoia Capital, like that's meant to kind of bring up status and power in society, right? So that's the habit. And that's why people want to go to those places too. And this is how it is that power then attracts more power to itself, is once you have that power within organizational habit, then more power gets attracted to it, right? And it's not for no reason. It's because they have the leverage and capital power to be able to make the decisions within a larger economy. So, of course, people who are interested in being a part of that power matrix are going to want to go and participate in that. It's why the US dollar has been able to maintain its position for so long, not simply because of its status, but it's attained a status because of its power. And then because it's then had that status, it's been able to gain more power, right? So there's like a feedback loop here, a self-reinforcing feedback loop that expands and expands and expands outwardly. So those with capital power are able to have more power. And then they're able to dictate more leverage over how it is that meaning activities, the acts of inscription, how it is that they take place in the future. So if you're a more powerful institution or entity, you can walk around the world and you could be like, that forest is now a forest for logging, and that water is now a region for fishing. And then you can change your mind and you can go, but actually, that forest, we're going to cut it down and we're going to build a factory there and we're going to build microchips there. And this is also what happens over time as technology and the demands for new types of technology put pressures on them, because people with capital power aren't just simply dictating the terms. They're also feeling certain pressures as well to be able to maintain their power. So there's a fragility there. So then they say, oh shit, now that forest is not for logging anymore because we're moving away from paper goods, and now that logging is all for new digital technologies, and so now we have to work with, electricity grids and kind of like hydropower groups to be able to make sure that we can build our factories there that can be fully sustainable in the years coming, so that we can build our microchips, so that we can build AI technologies over here. But they're the ones making the decisions because they've got more capital power, right? That's how the leverage works there. I'll go back to the little outline here real quick. Blah, blah, blah. They're given higher status through habit. They construct the means by which inscription proceeds. Essentially, they're the ones who create the conditions that allow for future meaning to take place anyway, right? Like, it'd be really difficult. This is where people power comes in, and this is where a lot of like left populist movements come in, because they also recognize this. This isn't the fight over the economy isn't just about redistribution of wealth, but it's also about like, how do we determine what's valuable to us as humans in the first place? How do we determine what resources we actually care about? This is where the battle over like climate change is drawn around like degrowth versus more kind of, growth versions. The degrowth camp is essentially like, but wait, what if we just change our framework over what is valuable for us in the first place as a society? We don't need everyone to be plugged into the fucking digital matrix. Maybe we need a slowdown. Maybe we need more people to like, I don't know, spend time in nature and be able to pursue their artistic passions in a community that is much slower than the rate of demand that those with capital power are trying to force upon us, right? Those are the types of conversations that take place at a political level that show you how this battle over inscription is not just some abstract theoretical activity, but it's actually clearly something that takes place at a social and political level as well. Jameer just commented, hey, Austin, big fan. I started listening to you freshman year in high school. Oh, shit. Now I'm about to graduate college. Fuck yeah, with a dual major in philosophy. Damn, you're an OG. You're an old head. Your content was a huge part of that. Love Owls at Dawn. Oh, well, Jameer, thank you so much. I actually just reconnected with Troy yesterday after a couple months. He's been fucking head buried doing research, and we just had a chat yesterday about doing a new episode of Owls at Dawn. So I think we've got a new episode of Owls at Dawn will be coming out. Listen, Troy and I will always be doing Owls at Dawn. So he'll love to hear that, Jameer. So thank you so much. But we'll have a new episode for Owls coming out next week. I'm going to get Troy on the live stream too. But amazing, Jameer. I'd love to know more about what you were studying in college. Let me know if you can in the chat. What were you studying? And I guess what are your plans now? Are you gonna do grad school? You gonna go do a PhD? You gonna go into the private sector? What are you gonna do? Love to hear that. But okay, so that's how inscription operates, right? So as such, the field of habitual meanings are produced in a milieu of asymmetrical power. Essentially, what that means is the people who have the power to make the decisions over what's meaningful for a given society and economy, they're the ones who are going to maintain more and more power. That power is going to accumulate back to them. It's asymmetrical, right? So that's where the political stakes, I guess, are drawn. So now investment decisions in the hands of those with power translate from fields of archived meaning. So now this is, okay, so now this goes to the idea of like the past meaning, archived meaning, right? Fields of archived meaning, those flows in meaning that might obtain. Okay, and then inscription is the way that flows of meaning are serially reproduced. Don't worry about that. Okay, great. So this part right here, investment decisions, field of archive meaning. What that means essentially is that, so not only are people looking in the present and being like, oh, that forest, that's going to be turned into now a place where we're going to build a Tesla factory or an NVIDIA factory, and we're going to manufacture, with high robotic mechanical processes, blah, 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 whatever. It's not just that, but it's also they have control over the library, the archive of meaning, right? So they don't just own the capacity to a higher degree to make decisions in the present, but they also own the past meaning, because they have control over how it is that you can deploy those past meanings in the present. So there might be past cultural meanings that are important to human beings. Like, I don't know, it's important to drink fucking water, right? That's something that humans have had meaning based around since humans began, right? And it meant a bunch of different things to a bunch of different societies. Water has meant 1,000 different things. It's been used for cleansing. It's been used for ritual. It's been used to kind of like create meaning within your society. It's been used to create irrigation. It's been used to connect societies, to connect towns together, to then create like larger trade relations, right? Or it can be bottled up and packaged and owned by a private corporation who then tells you that you need to drink their special water because it's Arrowhead spring water and from the source of the fucking mountain. And maybe it is, maybe it's not, probably not. I mean, I've seen some water plants that were bottling plants that were definitely not at the spring of a mountain. So I've seen them with my eyes, folks. And Douglas Murray says you can't make a comment on anything unless you've seen it with your eyes. Well, Douglas Murray, I've seen it with my fucking eyes. Okay, fuck Douglas Murray, by the way. But anyway, like they have control over the meaning of these things, right? And they can then redeploy them in the present and then make financial decisions moving forward about how it is that that future inscriptions and meanings will take place, right? Jameer comes back in and says, software engineering. Oh, sweet. Okay, so maybe philosophy of technology or law school. Sounds great. Well, keep us posted. I fucking love to hear that you've been around since you were a freshman in high school. That's amazing. Yeah. Fuck. Welcome to the chat. Thanks for being an OG. We love our old heads. All right. So that's inscription. That's how inscription works. Enclosure and fetish. So the way enclosure works is pretty clear, right? We've talked about this before. This is like the act of privatization. This is where a company comes in, or a consortium or some sort of conglomerate or a nation state even comes in and says, these resources belong to us. It's the act of privatization, the act of writing contracts, the act of legal frameworks. All of that stuff takes place at this point of enclosure. So the simple way of understanding is that it turns the commons, like common areas, a forest that's a common area, it turns that into an asset. Or it turns DNA. This is what the film Logan, right? Philosophy of Logan. That's what Logan is about, the Marvel film. Logan is about taking DNA and biological data, biological assets, and turning it into data. This is why a lot of people have fear over 23andMe and all those things, because it's like, oh, it turns human, like common biological, maybe personally possessed, personally owned, and it turns that into some sort of privatized data for a corporation that can use it for their own activities that won't benefit us. They siphon it from us. They extract it from us. Yes, we give it for a small penance. We get to have a little bit of fun and find out what our biological heritage is or some shit like that. But then they get to extract billions of dollars from it. So it seems disproportionate, right? The power asymmetry there in the act of enclosure is disproportionate. The people who get to work on the land in an activity of enclosure, they might get paid a wage, but the private corporation is going to siphon off much more surplus value from that, right? That's, again, an asymmetry that takes place in the act of enclosure. So enclosure operates fundamentally by turning commons into assets and doing it disproportionately to the benefit of those who are able to engage in the activity of enclosure in the first place, which are those who have capital power and leverage from inscription, right? So you can see how they connect and they relate to each other. You can't have one without the other. Enclosure is to seal something off and to make it tradable on the market. And so we can also think about fucking gated communities, patents, IP control, right? And this is also why certain battles over like IP protection for creators are so important, because if creators write a TV show, for example, I'm in the middle of negotiations right now. I've got a TV show that I've co-created, and we've got a production company that wants to option it, which basically gives them the option to be able to purchase it when it gets picked up by a broadcaster, right? And it's a really great production company, and they're amazing, but we're in the middle of negotiations right now over the terms, and some of the terms are about who owns certain rights, right? Um, to what extent are we going to be able to maintain control over those rights and deploy those parts of our rights? Like maybe we want to make a fucking stage show, maybe we want to write a novel about it, or maybe we want to make a YouTube series about it at some point, a podcast series. Who has control over those rights, right? Those things are important to figure out, because as soon as a broadcaster comes in, that broadcaster can come in. They've got all the power. They've got the leverage power, right? They've got the capital power. They can come in and they can be like, we own all of this stuff. We're going to deploy it in ways that are beneficial to us and our shareholders and our platform, et cetera, et cetera. So you see how this is like a real world issue that is facing people all the time. So this active enclosure is really important. Now, it also creates fetish objects. And I'll just put this screen up here for a second. So what is a fetish object? A fetish object is an object that is viewed, it's an object that is viewed as totally natural, or something is what it is, and what's not recognized is that it was actually constructed in a particular way, and it's actually artificial, right? So this goes to like the bedrock of something in like a Marxist critique of political economy that's really important. But it's not just Marxism. It's well beyond that. A lot of other economists as well are concerned with the object as a fetish, right? But it's basically where you take an object and you don't realize the labor that has gone into producing that object. You don't realize the supply chains that have gone into making that object. You don't realize the commodity chains globally that start from mining a resource to processing that resource, to putting that resource into a factory, to putting that into an assembly line, to then the human hands that have gone into putting different components together, to then it being put through the logistics chain where it's sent onto a truck that then's put onto a boat that's put into a shipping container, and then that's sent to another country, and then that country puts in other components, and then it's sent to another, right? It's this massive, really complex process, but at the end, what we get are objects, right? We get our fetish objects. I got my coaster here and I got my phone here, but I'm not looking at the processes that go into constructing this thing, or the many processes that go into constructing this, right? So we then relate to these objects as though a phone is just a phone, a coaster is just a coaster. This is where the idea of habit comes back in. We're habitualized into just relating to each other and to the objects that mediate our relations, just at that level of abstraction, at that level of fetish, right? And that does a disservice to kind of understanding how it is that things get to be how they are in the first place, who has the control mechanisms to dictate how things are the way they are. And this is where the larger social and political implications come in, because how is it that supply chains are structured? Who do these supply chains benefit? How is it that global commodity chains are structured? To what benefit? Where is value being produced? Where is it being extracted? Et cetera, right? And all of the various social relations that are impacted across that entire global commodity chain, or that global supply chain. So this is what's really important to understand about what happens at Enclosure, okay? So we'll go back here. So this is from my book. Enclosure is the contraction of virtual potencies. Don't worry about that. We'll talk about that in a second. Through the selection of meanings into forms of habit. So essentially, enclosure is where the people with capital power, the people with leverage, they look at the entire field of possible ways that we can understand what a field can be, and they then dictate, this is a field for our private uses and our private concerns now, based on what's important to us in a society. And so if you have that power, you have the power to dictate what natural resources are, what artificial resources are, biological resources, ecological resources, fucking whatever. You have the power to dictate that, which then really controls the flow of how a society operates, and how it is that the objects that make up our world, how it is that they are given meaning that we then live within. So that's where the political stakes are drawn on this. So enclosure is abstract conceptualization. It creates fetish objects. These objects are perceived as having functions, but really don't worry about that. Unless you've read the book, it doesn't make any sense. But enclosure is privatization. Um, it's the contractual cutting off of a set of activities by contractualization, by creating contracts that delimits discrete entities. It cuts things off. This is a field for NVIDIA, where a factory that's going to make NVIDIA chips, and it cannot be anything else. And you are not allowed to contest that because the powers that be have dictated so and made a contract about it and backed it up legally. And this is why when people talk about how the liberalization of the economy or neoliberalism is about deregulation, this is why it's bullshit, because that's not actually how it works. It works through massive regulation in protecting those private interests so that contractualization and the legalization that enforces that contractualization can actually take place at the level of the state. And that is why it is actually so regulated. Neoliberalization is not about the freeing up and the loosening up of regulation so that free markets can kind of like do their own thing. It's about ordering the economy in a particular way that benefits those with capital power against the democratic will of the people. And this is clearly stated by people who actually were the constructors of neoliberalism. This is why everyone should read Quinn Slobodian's book, Globalists. Gotta fucking read it. I'm going to put it in the chat. Because first of all, there are many other people that write about this as well. Martijn Konings writes about this. The whole authoritarian neoliberalism movement talks about this. But this book is like the fucking final word. Globalists, the end of empire. Here, I'm just going to fuck Amazon, so I'm going to put the Harvard link here. It's in the chat. Check out this book. Check out interviews. Oh, sorry. There it is. Globalists. I mean, this book has changed the fucking world. Neoliberals hate the state, or do they? In the first intellectual history of neoliberal globalism, Quinn Slobodian follows a group of thinkers from the ashes of the Habsburg Empire to the creation of the World Trade Organization to show that neoliberalism emerged less to shrink government and abolish regulations than to redeploy them at a global level. That's the whole point. It was about creating a global economy, a global order, where states then become the kind of deputies serving the larger global order. And ultimately, and they talk about this explicitly in the book, like the actual from the mouths of the people who constructed it, the neoliberals, the ordo liberals, the Chicago school economists. What they wanted to do is they wanted to insulate capital from the democratic will of the people. It's not a conspiracy theory. This is from their mouths. Read the book. I think you guys would benefit great from it. And it's a very accessible book. Or you can listen to interviews with him as well. Quinn Slobodian, he's a really great theorist. But okay, so that's what takes place right there. Contractualization, it delimits discrete entities, right? However, enclosure is never final. Okay? It's never final. I'll come back to my notes here. Enclosure is never final. It functions as though it were when someone delimits a certain territory and privatizes it and says, well, now this is X. That's supposed to be like a final word. It acts as though they're making a declarative statement on the reality of what that thing can be. That's what fetishization does. This is a coaster. This is an iPhone. That land is owned by X corporation, et cetera, et cetera. It tries to make a final word on something, which is an act of killing. It's an act of violence. It's an act of delimiting. It's an act of separation. It's an act of expropriation, right? But all enclosures are leaky. And that's important. And there's a lot of theorists actually in a field of study that's called critical finance theory that talk about this idea of leakiness. And what they mean is that even when we speak about something, if I say, oh, that's a tree, that's partly true and it's partly not true, right? There's truth to it in the sense that social convention has said that a tree is a tree. And there's also a sense in which it's more than a tree. There's also a sense in which it always exceeds our abilities to be able to enclose it with our conceptual abstractions, right? And the same thing happens in the economy. Luke says, I recall somebody defining neoliberalism as the defense of the market. That's Quinn Slobodian. Or maybe that was me in a video a couple of lives back, if you were watching that. Neoliberalism is the defense of the market against democracy. That's exactly right. And I think even more than that, we could say with this theory that I'm kind of putting together with IEQ, inscription, enclosure, and quantification, is that neoliberalism is the most efficient um, agreed upon global order for the canonization and the regulation and the protection of capital against democracy. And it does so through a concentration and consolidation of capital power. Those people who have the capital have the power. Those people who have control over how to name and give meaning to something have the power. Those people who have exclusive access to the history of meaning that they can then redeploy for their own purposes, they've got the power, right? So that's the way it works, inscription and enclosure. And finance, as a particular mechanism, is, I believe, the most efficient mechanism created to engage in this activity, right? Because it engages at a very abstract level, and because it's not bound by spatial limitations in the same way that industrial manufacturing processes are, right? Because I can go buy land in another country right now if I had the money, if I had the capital power at the snap of a finger, right? I could go take away through like activities like eminent domain, I could take away people's homes at the snap of a finger. I mean, it's more involved than that, but I think you get the point, right? And that's why I think finance gives us a really unique insight into how it is that capitalism operates more broadly, right? All right, and then the last point is this, quantification. So basically, math is never neutral, right? So despite what certain like rationalists and scientific geeks might say, math is never neutral. There is always some sort of social meaning that is embedded into how it is that we understand things. There's actually a brilliant book, I'm going to give you another resource. It's called Language, the Cultural Tool by Daniel Everett. Language, the Cultural Tool by Daniel Everett. And a really interesting book that I think everyone should read. Oh, here's the actual book. Ooh, you can get the actual book online. Fuck yeah, I'm just going to share that. Here you go, everybody. Merry Christmas. Check that out. So Language, the Cultural Tool by Daniel Everett he's an anthropologist, and I'm just going to get, and he is someone who spent years with, I believe they were called the Paraha people in the Amazon, and they basically don't have numbers in their language. They have words for like nothing, some, and more, from what I remember. And the importance of that is that what we need to then think is that like discrete mathematical conceptualization, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, is not something that we are born with, but it's something that's learned and inherited. And I think what that does is that gives us an insight into how it is then that we need to understand in the way that we think about it in its discrete earlier, where it's like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kind of, you can carve things up and they're replaceable, and you can make things commensurate, 1 and 1, and they kind of get matched up together. That all of that is taking place at a level of social convention and human abstraction, right? So now, if that's true, and we take in the first 2 points, enclosure and inscription, into consideration as well, I think you can see where I'm going with this. That also means that those people who have the capital power and the leverage to create meaning, that those people who have more perpetually consolidating power to create activities of enclosure and privatization, and then to canonize that through regulation and contracts and support from governments and things like that, or militaries and things like that, they also have the power to dictate how things are priced. They also have the power to control the mechanisms of pricing. They also have a greater control over how it is that we determine how we value things as price. And I think it's important to say how we value things as price, because there's a difference. There should be a difference between value and price, right? Like, you can value something deeply and it can have no, quote, economic value, right? the price might be meaningless, like some sort of painting that your kid makes or a photo of your great grandmother, that is priceless to you, but that is not priceable on the market. Now, some things are priceable. Maybe it's a photo of John Wayne from when he was a kid, and some John Wayne collector wants to like buy it or something like that. Well, then an old photo can be priceable. But if it's just like maybe someone that history doesn't value, that the economy doesn't value as much, then maybe it's not priceable, right? Um, we know this, that there is a distinction between value and price, right? But those who have the power to dictate the terms over how it is that we live in a society and an economy, particularly those with capital power, those who have the control over the financial mechanisms, they're the ones who are able to actually determine how things are priced, right? Um, the difficulty here is that, so like numbers lie, numbers erase nuance, right? Just like the other activities of abstraction do. They fetishize, they cover over all of the processes of construction that go into composing our products. And we just, when we go to the store, we just think, oh, that's 5, that's 3, that's 2. I've got 20. I can get this amount of this, that amount of that amount of this, right? I got $20. I've got 20 pounds. I got 20 euros. I can get 2 of those at $2, 2 of those at 2 years, whatever, right? We do the calculations all the time. We're not thinking about the other activities behind them that have gone into the production of those things. And that's what we do. We relate out the level of price, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that we need to understand, that that's how we relate about things, because we're trying to say, well, how does my 20 get me access to those things that I need because I'm hungry or because a light bulb burned out or whatever it is. So I need some of that, right? So it's okay. It's not like I'm saying that we should live in a world that has no numbers attached to it. But it's important to understand who has control and what are the processes that have gone into the construction of things as they currently are. And could they have been constructed differently? And can they be constructed differently under different power regimes? And that's where the political component comes in. Okay. So I'll read this last little bit. So extensional quantification, again, this is from the book. Inscription and enclosure are mathematized via extensional quantification. The most notable act of extensional quantification is pricing. The mathematization of meanings and enclosed entities converts any possible entity into that which can be calculated. The point here is that through the process of quantification or mathematization, you can take any possible asset, a field, a tree, a body of water, whatever, and you can convert that into something that can be calculated, something that can be priced, something that can be traded, and then in financial terms, something that can be securitized, right? And you can use that and you can package it into a portfolio. That portfolio can be bundled with a bunch of other assets in a portfolio, and then you can price that on the market and you can speculatively trade it, right? I think the important thing for me here is this word, conversion. And I think this is actually really important to think about. So there's an activity of conversion that takes place. So that means that a tree isn't a natural resource that has many possible uses, but a tree then becomes priced and converted into a particular thing as it's put into a portfolio based on a very narrow conception of how it can be used for those with capital power and the leverage to do so. So this activity, this notion of conversion to me is really important because I think there's a religious component here. So I think the economy fundamentally operates according to a religious logic of conversion. And it's a type of conversion that promises that there's going to be some sort of ultimate benefit in the end. And this is where there's like this philosophical and speculative and metaphysical component that is often unacknowledged and that most people are entirely ignorant of when they think about the economy, the global economy, social economic activities, political economic power structures. There are some amazing theorists that have written about this. We talked about Benjamin, I think, in our last live stream, Walter Benjamin, who talks about capitalism as religion. Joseph Vogel has written about this. There's many other people who have written about this that I think they're on the right track. And one of the things that I would want to add to this as somebody who has a deep connection to theology and has spent many years pondering religion and religion's relation to society and culture is thinking about this activity of conversion in a financial transaction or an economic transaction from something that's been given meaning and then privatized and then quantified, that essentially what's taking place is that things are then forced into conversion so that they can then fit within the larger system, which sounds an awful lot to me like how the church says you must convert as a human so that you can fit within the community that will receive salvation. To me, it's not just an analogy. To me, it's the same activity. What's taking place is that secular institutions are engaging, private institutions are engaging in activity of capital conversion, which then puts the objects, the assets, into a portfolio that are then hoping to be, or that are on the path towards freedom, heaven, release, liberation, whatever. Right? Now, the language that they use is different. The language they use is like global economic prosperity or some shit like that. That's the promise that's fed to the assets. And here's the thing that's important. We've been talking a little bit about like these kinds of objects that we think of as like typical commodities, but we got to think about humans as well. Human beings are priced. The value of you as a laborer is priced. I mean, that's what we talk about when we talk about GDP and unemployment numbers. When bond markets are trying to figure out how it is that they're going to engage in their trading activities over domestic bonds or corporate bonds, one of the things they factor is a company's workforce and its efficiency and its output and its productivity. And when they look at when they look at a national economy, they do the exact same thing. And if they think that there are people who are not holding their weight, like there's too many fucking people being a burden on the welfare system, they can put pressure on a domestic economy to discredit those people, to either get them to ship off and go to another country, right? Which is something that they've done in Ireland, right? Go to the fucking UK and go work there because we got no jobs for you. So what we got to do is we've got to be able to appease the bond market. We've got to be able to get private corporations here, create a tax shelter for them. Sorry, we can't create like public housing and create more job opportunities for the domestic people, but you guys can go to the UK, they'll take you, right? Or you can go elsewhere in the world, they'll take you, right? You're a burden on the system. Or you just attack the burdens on the system through political campaigns and through social campaigns, and then you create divisions politically, and then you have a candidate that can rise up, and you can be like, they're the burden on the system. We need to discredit them. And at least if you can pay lip service to that, the bond market will be like, oh, okay, they're protecting our investment interests, so the value of that domestic economy's bonds are going to be okay. Or a corporation, they're going to fire some people. Layoffs are coming, so their corporate bonds are going to be valuable. So this is how human beings are actually priced as well, and they're converted into numbers for the purpose of those larger economic and financial activities, right? So that's an act of conversion. Now, the problem is once you've been converted, then you're subject to the power of the institution. It can dictate how you, in your status as a converted subject, how you fit within the larger matrix. And it's very similar, if not identical, to how it is that a church mechanism operates. Okay? So I think that's really interesting and important for us to think about. Now, what I then go on to talk about in the book are money and debt, institutions, and subjectivity. And this is where I'll close. This is where I'll wrap up. Okay. And the reason this is important is this is for us to think about, like, how do we actually think about, like, the kind of everyday things that we talk about, banks and money, nations, etc., right? So money is not neutral, right? Money operates within this matrix. And money operates at the intersection or the interface between inscription, enclosure, and quantification. So Philip Goodchild, who was actually my master's degree supervisor, talks about how money has the power to inscribe, enclose, and quantify, right? And what that means essentially is that money is the primary way. It is the agreed upon social convention, economic social convention that we use today to give meaning to things, to secure the enclosure of certain things, and then to quantify things, right? Debt is another way that we utilize this. So I've actually got, let me read here. So I've got this larger passage. Let me read this. This is from my book. So what I say is that money must be understood as inscriptive. That is, it is a device that carries meaning from transaction to transaction. It can also be understood as enclosure in its tendency to demarcate the limits of value, right? Money is what kind of sets the limits over how we value things. And which relates to its appearance as extensionally quantified value as price, right? Now, here's where there's like a wrinkle in all of this. We talked about how there's this other component, this unconscious component, that things are leaky, right? That all enclosures are leaky, that there's something more than this that's actually also taking place, you know? Any act of inscription is never final. Any act of enclosure is never total. Any act of quantification is always a little bit leaky, always a little bit true, but also not true. So that means that there is something, and this is where I draw from the work of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, where they talk about deterritorializing flows, right? That there are these flows that break the bounds of all of our efforts to abstract and to consolidate and to conceptualize. And these flows are always there, persisting, insisting, subsisting, transforming, contesting. When someone like Marcel Duchamp goes to goes and puts the urinal into the National Gallery and calls it a fountain, what he's doing is he's like tapping into these flows that are beyond the kind of habitual conventions that have been foisted upon society, right? So what this means then is that there are certain limits that inscription, enclosure, and quantification run into. And that is where the site of struggle and contestation and transformation can take place, is right at those limits. Because we can say, but money could mean something else. We can use it in different ways. We could create community banks. We don't have to lend with like people and interest rates that are going to crush people, payday lenders and bridge loans that have extremely high interest rates just so that people with capital power and leverage can continue to maintain their control over the inscripting, enclosing, and quantifying processes, right? It could be different. We can create business organizations that are cooperative, where the people who work there actually own portions of the actual company structure itself, and are not just being paid a wage, but that are actually paid as, you know, cooperative partners. We can create social wealth funds where natural resources are co-owned by the common people who, as a collective society, nurture and care for the value of that natural forest or those natural resources. And rather than just redistributing wealth through taxation, later relying on government institutions to do so, we can engage in activities of what's called pre-distribution, where there's a common ownership over those things, and we can all benefit from common shareholding value over those resources, right? Um, okay. Blah, blah, blah. Money is what's most desired in our economy. The reason it's most desired is because it becomes like the central power that determines, that mediates how it is we engage in inscription, enclosure, and quantification. So money then is the most desirable thing because money is the primary technology or instrument that keeps the economy moving forward, that keeps capital moving, that keeps the leverage relations moving, that primarily dictates how it is that activities of inscription, enclosure, and quantification take place. So that means money becomes the most desirable thing in this paradigm, in this framework, in this matrix. So money creates desire, but it creates a desire for more money, right? And this is where there's a psychoanalytic component that comes in, because money creates desire for more money, which creates desire for more money, which creates desire for more money, which means there's this endlessly receding goalpost that you're perpetually chasing after. And it's something that you can never get enough of. And so the more you get, the more you need so that you can continue to engage more in the activities, which diverges between the rich and the poor. And there's a brilliant article by a friend of mine named Amin Saman, who writes about what he calls like the eternal return, or the kind of like the affective desire over money, and how it splits differently between the asset rich and the asset poor. Because for the asset rich, this activity of the endlessly receding goalpost is like exhilarating and thrilling, because you're chasing the carrot, but you're getting great returns back in the process. Whereas the asset poor are the ones who are burdened perpetually, one by frustration, because you can never actually get an appropriate return for the amount of desire that you put into the pursuit of money. But also two, because the only way that you can actually play the game is insofar as you've been converted to be debt burdened within the larger financial matrix, right? And so you have debt, and you have not only a literal sense, and you have credit card debt and a mortgage and student loan debt and whatever, but car debt, car loan debt, um, debts to your subscriptions that you've paid or that you've prepaid for, whatever. Um, Not only that, but you've also got a social debt. And the social debt is the one that's like, well, in order to be a good subject, you must continue to play the game, right? So then there's a punishing, and again, this is where the religious aspect comes in. There's a punishing guilt mechanism that's built into this as well. And it leads to something that's called like the debt drive of capitalism. So people have heard of death drive, but I refer to it as the debt drive that perpetually impels us forward, right? And it's pathological, and it's repetitive, and there's never any closure to it. There's never any contentment on the other side. The promise is a lie. In the book, I talk about how it promises fulfillment, and but it only ends up in deferment. It promises settlement, but it only ends up like a perpetual desiring, right? And the more intense this system bears down upon you individually and us socially, the more it sows the seeds of dissatisfaction and discontent and tension and frustration. And then, of course, that's when someone can come in like a Trump and take advantage of that, or like anybody, like a Maloney. I mean, even someone like an Obama, a charismatic figure, can come in and say, I have named the problem. I have the solutions. And that's where charismatic political figures come in and are able to, draw the tensions and sow the seeds of discord within a given society, right? And of course, I think the most potent example of that is like the most recent rise of authoritarian neoliberalism around the world, who have really used like the language of populism to try to drum up support for them based around these tensions that have been realized. But what they're not actually getting at is the reality that's underneath the surface, which is this larger debt drive system that's actually sowing the seeds of dissatisfaction and discontent. Okay. So that's the first thing. And then financial institutions, that's the next thing that we can talk about. So financial institutions are like banks, right? The Basel Accords, the derivative system, financial institutions, and even nation-state governments, right? And these are the institutions who have the capital power and the leverage to create the mechanisms by which the debt drive of the money economy and of capitalism operates, right? And all this other stuff, inscription, enclosure, quantification. It's the institutions who have the power to consolidate, the capacity to consolidate that power and create those leverage relations, that are then able to perpetuate and reproduce their power from moment to moment to moment to moment. And then to actually dictate the terms by which the future has meaning in the first place. So the future doesn't even have fucking meaning on its own. The vision of the future as that which we must pursue is created by those who have this power and this leverage in the first place, which again is very dogmatic and very religious to me. And as a matter of fact, in the book, what I talk about is how Gilles Deleuze would refer to this as what's called the dogmatic and moral image. Because not only is it dogmatic in the sense that this is kind of like, these are the rules of how the game must be played, but it's also moral in the sense it's like, and if you don't play it accordingly, you're the failure. And if you don't play it well enough, then you should be ashamed of yourself. Work harder, sell your labor more intensely, um, engage more efficiently in your commercial pursuits, right? Trust the economy more. Give your fidelity more to the institutions who have control over the leverage mechanisms of the global debt drive system. And that's where there's this religious component as well. So I'll just briefly, in the book, kind of at the very end, I talk about how financial institutions primarily operate as scaled up leverage mechanisms within this larger process. They are the essential actors. We are inessential, right? Or the component parts, the objects within the economy are inessential, but they then become essential actors. They're agents. And this is an idea that I derived from Jean-Paul Sartre in his book, The Critique of Dialectical Reason, which is actually, I write about in my first book, if any of you are interested in that. It's called Sartre, Sartre Imagination and Dialectical Reason, Creating Society as a Work of Art. And there are ways to find it out there for free, so don't even worry. There's a paperback version that's affordable, probably a Kindle version, but if you can get it out there, I don't care. It's just got some cool ideas, I think. But essentially what Sartre talks about is how the logic of the institution is that the head of the institution, or that the logic of the institution, that's the essential actor, and everything else that's like underneath its control or its remit, that those things are its inessential component parts, right? And they don't really matter. They can be swapped out and exchanged insofar as everything just serves the overall logic and the overall desire, we might say, of the centralized power within that institution. So that's how institutions operate here, okay? And then here's the thing that I think is the most interesting, and maybe kind of like one of the newer ideas that's out there, and it's about us as subjects, human subjectivity, right? How is human subjectivity affected or impacted by this larger way of understanding how capitalism operates and how finance operates through inscription, enclosure, and quantification? Well, essentially, you become a component part, a subject within a portfolio. But also, you are forced to, you are compelled to, we are compelled to become portfolio managers ourselves, right? And in our process of conversion, this is another way that I think conversion is important, is we are converted into portfolio subjects. We are converted into assets within a portfolio, and we are assets who have our own assets. And those assets are the only thing that are valuable within the larger structure. And if you don't increase the value of your asset portfolio, then you're a bad subject within the portfolio. So this is where there's, I think, a really insidious activity of how it is that human beings are assetized, but you are then fed the lie that you can be freed from your asset position if you just become a more robust portfolio manager of your own assets, right? So here's a quote. So the CEO of Goldman Sachs, David Solomon, well, this is 2020. I don't know if he's still the CEO. He basically remarked how consumer spending has overcompensated for the slowdown in manufacturing and capital spending. And this has taken place through the construction of subjectivities that are ever increasingly taking on the logics of this larger economy. Now, what this means essentially is that so and this fits really well within the whole trade war, tariff war thing that's going on as well, because people are like, oh God, like manufacturing has slowed down, capital spending has slowed down. But what's happened is that we as consumers have increased our consumer spending, and that's overcompensated for. That's how it is that we've been able to afford nice things still, even though there are trade imbalances. And there's a lot of capital flows that are coming in that are allowing for Western nations, advanced capitalist nations, to continue consumption spending, even when there is like a slowdown in manufacturing and capital expense. So Michelle Fair is someone who I've talked about a lot in any of my work or interviews that I've done or podcasts or anything like that. He wrote a book called Rated Agency. And I think that it's really important to think about what he says because essentially he's the one who first popularized this idea that we are portfolio subjects. And what that means is that our primary value is dictated insofar as we can accumulate those assets and then court investment from other subjects into our portfolio. So that's how we build out our robust portfolio within the larger portfolio of which we are assets, right? Is we're all engaging laterally with each other as subjects, right, in a society to try to like get more investment into our portfolio. And the way that it works digitally is like, get more followers and get more subscribers. The way that it works financially is to get a better job position, maybe more people on LinkedIn, and then you can climb the corporate ladder. And it works across a bunch of different metrics. But the idea is that we're perpetually just putting ourselves out there to try to get investment, which is, I mean, from a human psychological perspective, it's like totally unhealthy, right? If we're constantly prostrating ourselves before the validation of others so that they can inflate the value of our asset portfolio so that we can be better asset subjects within a larger asset portfolio. Like that's no wonder people are fucking miserable because they're caught within this treadmill, within this rat race, this wheel that is perpetually compelling us forward to go more and more and more and faster and faster and faster, and then guilting us when we're not getting the appropriate returns, not realizing that the game is rigged, that we'll never get the appropriate returns that will make us feel validated, right? So Ivan Asher also has written a book on this, where he talks about how we are subjected in this process to the means of prediction. And what he means by that is we're subjected to like the whims of financial speculation and that gambit that those with leverage power and capital power are perpetually playing when they're speculating on the market and when they're engaging in their financial activities, when they're doing their processes of inscription, enclosure, and quantification, right? For Asher, credit ratings and social credit systems are really instructive because that's how it is that we measure ourselves and our success within a society. What's your credit rating? Well, can you buy a car? Can you buy a house? Can you get a phone? Do you have to have a cosigner? And these are things that we're perpetually like measuring ourselves against. You get emails all the time. Your credit rating score is good. It's bad. It's going to be affected. Don't do this or it's going to be blah, blah, blah. There's a punishing system here, right? And again, for the asset rich or the credit strong, it's an exhilarating thing because you're like, fuck yeah, I got power. I'm doing it right. I'm winning the game. I'm playing the game well. I'm accepted. If you're behind the ball, you're fucked, right? If you've made some stupid mistakes, maybe when you were young, if you just were victim of circumstance, if you were subjected to an injury, a lot of different things that people shouldn't be fucking punished for, even if it was a mistake that you made when you were 18 years old and you got a shitload of fucking gambling debts or something like that. Like, I don't think that shit should burden us for the rest of our lives. Yeah, granted, consequences for our action, sure, et cetera, but rehabilitation and restoration. We live in a society that doesn't allow for that. And especially if it's someone who just gets injured in a fucking car accident or has a baby and you're burdened by fucking hospital bills, like that should not have some sort of impact over in how it is that you are perceived within a social economy. But it does because you're burdened by debt and it puts an immense amount of stress and pressure on people. And it can actually foreclose your capacity to be a more viable operator within the economy moving forward. That's fucked. I think that's fundamentally fucked. So this is what I talk about then, and this is the last thing I'll say. What this does is this creates like forms of subjectivity that I call liquid subjects or illiquid subjects, right? So liquid subjects are those that are more capable of meeting the obligations of the larger economy, and illiquid subjects are those that are highly incapable of doing so. So this is basically, I've got so much more that I could say. Like I said, this is all based on a book that's hopefully forthcoming. It's with a publishing company right now that's reviewing a university press. I'll let everybody know, obviously, when and if it comes out, and I'll probably do more talks about it, and more chats about it. But I think the important thing for us to remember is that there is a way that capitalism operates, and it might be different than the way that we typically think about it. Whether you are a radical lefty and you come from a Marxist perspective, or whether you are like an ANCAP, Mises follower, the way that we think about finance, the way that we think about capitalism, I think is typically wrong. And I think of the better way for us to think about finance is that it isn't just about numbers and prices in an abstract sense. And finance is not something fictitious. And capitalism isn't simply about like the historical progression of expropriation and exploitation, but that rather that there's this strange interplay of these mechanisms that are taking place all concurrently. It's inscription, enclosure, quantification. And then, of course, the excess that isn't quantifiable, that's not enclosable, and that's not inscriptable. And these things are all taking place perpetually at every fucking moment. And I hesitate to even say at every moment because then I'm making a discrete abstraction about the moment. And that's the whole point, is that there's this battle between the flows that are non-inscribable, non-enclosable, non-quantifiable, and the mechanisms of power of habit and memory and social convention and capital power and leverage and institutionalization and abstract quantification that are doing their damnedest to perpetually abstract and create those concrete things, because then you can manage it and then you can control it. As soon as you carve up and you say this is that and that is that, then you can have control over it. You can benefit from it, which again isn't a bad thing per se, but when it's slotted into and then overdetermined by a system of asymmetrical power, then it becomes exploitative. And that's the fundamental concern. So I think that if we can go forward and we can think of capitalism and think of its financial mechanisms as operating by mechanisms of inscription, enclosure, and quantification, that will help us to kind of unlock some things. And just watch the news and think about this threefold: inscription, enclosure, quantification. When you're watching Breaking Points or Democracy Now! Or MSNBC or Fox or wherever you get your news from, right? Whatever you're watching, think about how it is that people talk about the economy and about society. And you'll start to notice that these activities of inscription, enclosure, and quantification are everywhere. They don't think of it that way. As a matter of fact, oftentimes they try to deny that those components are like fundamental forces and realities within the system, but it's fucking there and you can't get away from it, right? And then think about that final component, the part that is the unconscious, the social unconscious that is excessive of all of that, right? The part that isn't acknowledged, the part that is there underneath the surface that we could maybe give testament to if we could figure out other ways to take control over the leverage mechanisms of power. And that's what I think is really interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up there. That's how capitalism really works. I would even go so far as maybe to say how we can think about how capitalism really is, because then this helps us understand how it is that it functions as a larger logic of life that controls how we think, act, and feel, you know? So that's that. I'm done talking. Love y'all.